We now move on to centering Black boys. Implicit bias is rampant in education. Children feel it in at least 4 ways. Expectations of classroom behavior, perceptions of hostility and violence, assumptions of innocence and accountability, expectations of intelligence and academic performance, and microaggressions. I'll give you 2 illustrations from the book, and then 2 from my personal life. In the first example, a Black boy preschooler in Los Angeles was regularly bumping into a white girl because he liked her and wanted to get her attention. Her parents became angry and complained to the school director, who told them, "Don't worry, we'll ensure your child's safety." The toddler was pathologized. This process is also akin to something that happens commonly called adultifying, in which transgressions of a child are made to take on a sinister, intentional, fully conscious tone, rather than one reflecting childish naivety. And it is not the only example of that. A different example from the book. 2 student teachers visited a classroom in a middle class but racially diverse area of Chicago, Hyde Park, and noticed to their shock that while the entire class was working cooperatively on a math project, all the Black boys were lined up against the wall working alone. The teacher explained that she had put them on their own quote unquote island because, quote, they just could not behave themselves. They were consistently unfocused while grouped with other students, unquote. The authors point out how this island normalized marginalization of these children away from the center of teaching and learning, teaching these boys and their classmates that Black boys are inherently deviant. It doesn't motivate students to learn, but it demonstrates the teacher's power to control Black bodies and humiliate students. Early childhood educators at a national conference were prompted to examine video clips of preschool children, and they themselves were monitored by eye tracking equipment. The children were acting entirely normally, but teachers were prompted to look for challenging behaviors, quote unquote. As a result of this prompt, teachers spent 42% of their time watching Black boys for these supposed challenging behaviors, more than any other group. Perceptions of hostility and violence. College students asked to identify a toy or a gun after shown a Black or white 5-year-old boy frequently mistook Black boys with toys as having guns and white boys with guns as having toys. Assumptions of less innocence and more accountability. Police officers with greater dehumanization towards Black boys, tested through unconscious association tests, had more histories of violent encounters with children. And college students tended to judge Black boys as less innocent and 4.5 years older than white peers, categorizing some 13-year-olds as adults. And another example of adultification of children. Next, I'll give 2 personal examples to illustrate the last 2 impacts of racism. In 1985, Professor Richard W. Thomas, a scholar of racism, noticed his son's intellectual potential was being ignored by white peers fascinated by the stereotype that Black men are examples of great physical strength. He recognized this pattern of low expectations of intelligence and bribed his son to outperform his classmates in math, just in time for schools to track the boy towards eventual high school calculus. Professor Thomas recently encouraged his grandson Adib's interest in poetry and chess for the same reason.
Then he moved there, and I was like, checkmate, I win.
Another example, a 9-year-old mixed-race Black-white boy living in rural Wisconsin has a history of coming home crying like a puddle on the floor from school. He feels when white boys misbehave, the teacher allows it, but when he does something small, he gets into trouble. He reports that when other students ask questions, the teacher answers, but when he asks, his teacher says, just figure it out. His teacher is a 26-year-old white woman who attended school in a mostly white mid-sized town. One day his teacher asked for everyone to name their favorite food. When he answers plantain, she asked him to name, quote, an American food, unquote. Just before this talk, he was called the N-word in a playground and tried to cut his forehead with a pair of scissors. His parents have pulled him from school and are now considering moving to another state. Let's discuss bias and expectations for Black students. Johns Hopkins researchers studied math and reading teacher expectations for a nationally representative sample of 10th graders in 2002. After 10 years, they correlated the inter-student variation in these expectations with actual educational attainment and determined how white and Black teachers differed in their expectations of students. White teachers had lower expectations for Black versus white students when controlling for objective student data. Using 3 strategies for causation, they also correlated the teacher's expectations with the student college graduation rates. They were predictive of the students' graduation rates. One of the biggest challenges in microaggressions, to look at our second example, is ambiguity. But microaggressions come in 3 types. Microassaults, overt acts of discrimination against someone's identity, such as stereotypical comments or jokes. For instance, my sister was called African booty scratcher and burnt toast. Micro-insults, verbal or behavioral messages that convey bias. You must be strong, like Mr. T, or as I was called when I was a physician, you've got dreadlocks, we should call you Dr. Marley. And where are you from? And micro-invalidations, verbal communications that deny, refute, or minimize a marginalized person's experience, such as, well, why did you want to go to a Black college? Or, with my sister, assumptions from high school teachers that she shouldn't be in college prep classes, and then surprised when she excelled. What is the result of this? Well, with adults, we focus on weathering and racial battle fatigue. But for children, this can cause decreased academic success and account to an adverse childhood event, which, as you recall, when we discuss ACEs, adverse childhood events are like setting footprints in cement. Let's go on to another example of this.
There's no blame or shame. Like we just have to realize the world we live in, and realize that we were purposefully, as white people, not educated and not told the truth. And but we are harming our children. We are harming our young children of color, and specifically Black boys, and tearing away at their soul and tearing away at their humanity. And but what are you going to do to find out what you don't know? And how does your whiteness affect that? And how does your ignorance affect that? And how does systemic racism affect that?
In our last section, we'll discuss what you can do.